Right, good afternoon everybody. Thanks for coming. My name's Tor Mitchell and I'm going to be talking a little bit about product management today. Before we get stuck into it, just a little bit of background on who I am and why I'm here. So I graduated having studied physics a long time ago. And while I was at university, I got a job with a small internet service provider in my hometown, which was Bournemouth. And that was in 1995. The internet was really just beginning to emerge into sort of the mainstream consciousness. And it immediately grabbed me as something that was interesting and exciting and clearly going to become quite important. And so when I graduated, I got a job with a company called Sun Microsystems. And they were a big workstation and networking technology provider back in the late 90s. They did extremely well in sort of the dot-com boom. They didn't do so well when it all went wrong in 2000, 2001. And a few years later were actually bought by Oracle. But they were a great company to work for at that time. They were really in the thick of what was going on. And after about 8 years with Sun, both in the UK and in California, I moved back home and joined Google. And at Google I was sort of more on the engineering side, although I was never really a developer. I was never a hardcore coder. But I was helping businesses use Google technology. And a few years in, I moved to Australia and joined their Sydney office. And while I was there, I switched to working on maps and then moved into a product management role. Now, before I moved to Google, I didn't really understand what a product manager was or why it might be something I was interested in. But since then, it's something I've become very passionate about. And I was with Google for 9 years in total, including a couple of years at the end back in San Francisco. And then moved back to the UK 2 years ago, almost to the day, to join Crowdcube. Now, Crowdcube are a equity crowdfunding startup. So they're a company of about 80 people that helps businesses raise finance as an alternative to venture capital or angel investment through a kind of Kickstarter-style model. Except that, unlike Kickstarter, where you just get a product at the end, you actually become a shareholder in the company. We're actually based down in Exeter, somewhat unusually, but we have an office in London as well, and I lead the product team at Crowdcube. So that's the team of product managers in the company. So when I joined Crowdcube, the first thing I was asked to do was build a team. There was only one product manager there and they were relatively junior. And so we needed to build up a team of product managers to partner with the engineers and make sure the right products were being built. And at Google, I'd worked with both experienced product managers and also several graduates who had joined Google's Associate Product Management Scheme, which is their graduate training and recruitment scheme for product managers. It's very well respected and they were phenomenal. They were just extraordinary. And I was very keen to take that experience and try and replicate it to some extent at Crowdcube, bring in some younger people and train them into the role. But it turned out this role was extremely difficult to fill. Not because it's not a great job, but because nobody has any idea what it is. So students weren't looking for roles like this. They didn't recognize it as something interesting when they saw it. Which seemed like a shame, because I think it's something that a lot of people would really enjoy, especially if you have a bit of an entrepreneurial streak. I was also at a few events, and I began to realize that in the UK, there's essentially no pipeline of upcoming product managers. People move into the role halfway through their careers when they sort of stumble across it and think, oh, that's interesting. I wish I knew that existed sooner. And that there was this gap at the bottom, if you like. And so after a few bad experiences with hiring and things like that, I decided, well, let's see if we can do something about this. And so I started a personal project on the side to try and raise awareness of product management amongst undergraduates and graduates. So this talk is sort of part of that effort. Okay, so this is the basic shape of what I'll be talking about today. Just explain what a product manager is. Talk a little bit about why I think it's an interesting role and a role that you might find exciting. And then talk about how you would get started or how you would get a toe in the door. As part of the first section, which is probably the bulk of the talk, I'll also go into a case study, an example of a product that I managed, so we can talk about exactly what was involved in doing that. Okay, I should also mention that I'm not in a rush to get away at the end, so I'm happy to take questions either as a group or in person afterwards, or follow up over email if you prefer. All right, so what is a product manager? So at its, oh, that's a good point. One thing I should mention is that when I talk about product management in the context of this talk, I'm really talking about what's sometimes called digital product management, which is just a way of saying product management in technology companies. And in fact, if you go online and you sort of do research on product management, almost everything out there is really about digital product management, because the role grew out of technology companies around 10 years ago, and is now very well established, particularly in the US, but increasingly here in the UK as well. And it's now beginning to seep out of technology into other sectors as people realize the value of the role. But if you look at it in the hardware sector or consumer products, it's a little bit different, and I can't really speak directly to that experience. So I'm going to focus mostly on technology companies. So this is kind of an obvious slide. Before we talk about what a product manager is, we have to define what we mean by a product. Essentially, any piece of hardware, software, or a service that you might offer to consumers or businesses. Anything that falls into that category, be it an app on your phone, a digital camera, or an event you're running, these things all qualify as products in this context. Okay, so we've got a product. What's a product manager? Well, if you look at any modern technology company, you'll find that almost every single product they offer has a product manager. That product manager may manage more than one product, but there will be someone who is in that role and who's responsible for managing that product. And what does that mean, managing a product? Well, essentially it's the person who ultimately owns the success of that product. Their job is to figure out how to make what that product should be and how to make it a success. They are the face of the product inside the company and outside the company. They're the person that everybody turns to when they want to understand what they should be doing or how it's going or what's happening next. So, an analogy I like to use for this is that of a conductor of an orchestra. Because product managers are not, as I mentioned, developers. We don't write products, we don't build products, we don't design products. We are essentially an orchestration function. But an interesting one, because you think about the conductor of an orchestra, they don't play any instruments, but they decide what music should be played, and then they coordinate all the musicians to deliver the best possible experience to the audience. The product manager is very similar. We don't build things, but we coordinate all the functions necessary to deliver a great experience to the user. So another interesting thing about product management, and one of the things that I think makes it an exciting role, is it's one of very, very few roles that has a complete 360-degree view of what's going on around the product, who's there from the very beginning, from its conception, right to the end, the day that you decide that it's past its prime and you're not going to offer it anymore. So that journey breaks down into a set of discrete steps, and you're involved closely all the way through. The first step, obviously, is, well, what's your idea? What are you going to build? What are you going to offer? And it's a common misconception that it's the job of a product manager to come up with ideas, and that's not true. The job of a product manager is essentially to collect ideas, because ideas are everywhere. Your customers, your users, your resellers, your sales team, your marketing team, inside the company and outside the company, and what's going on in the competitive environment. These are all signals that can generate ideas for opportunities that you might have to build a great product. And your job as the product manager is to collect all of that and then sort of synthesize it together, recognize patterns, recognize gaps, recognize opportunities, and then propose a product or a solution to this problem that you could offer in the market. And when you propose it, you have to build a case for why it's the right thing to do, and that case needs to be backed with data. So you might want to do some research to understand what the opportunity is. But what you're looking to get to is a clearly defined vision for what that product could be. A vision that you can take to your management team and get them to agree to, a vision that you can take to your engineers and get them excited by, a vision you can take to your customers and test the market. And that last step is critical, because ideas are great, but they're just ideas. And you don't really know if they're good ideas until you speak to the people who will actually benefit. So you have to go out there and do research. You have to speak to your potential customers, your potential users. They may be inside your business or outside your business. But you need to do research. Sure.
Do you need stakeholders?
Not just stakeholders. Stakeholders are clearly important, but I mean actually figuring out people who you might sell this product to, or who might be interested in using this product, and finding out, is this something they actually are interested in? Is the problem you've identified really a problem, or a problem serious enough that they would be willing to consider a new solution to it? Because it's a very common mistake to think, oh, if we built this thing, then users could do this, could do that, right? That thing that sounds useful. But actually, when you speak to them, they're like, yeah, that's not really a problem for me. This isn't causing me a lot of pain. Sure, if it was in front of me, I might use it, but I'm not going to make a conscious effort to go out there, find it, and adopt it, and then advocate for it amongst my friends, for example. So you really need to find a product idea that resonates with your potential audience if you're really going to get any traction behind it. And so what you're trying to get to really is a set of requirements. You're trying to get to what we used to call a specification, right? A list of this is what the product is going to do, this is the features it's going to offer, this is the services that it provides. And then you take that set of requirements and you take it to your design team. So when we talk about design, we're not just talking about visual design. That is one aspect, but that sort of happens towards the end when you're actually doing the visual polish. The first step of design is just figuring out what your user journeys are going to be. What are the flows through your product? How are people going to move through it? This is what we call interaction design. And you take that research, you take those requirements, you give it to your design team, and they will come up with ideas or proposals for how your product might work, how it might fit together. As the product manager, you're the user advocate in this conversation. In fact, in this whole process, you're the user advocate. So your job is to listen to those ideas and give them feedback on which you think will work best for your users and your customers. And again, there may be rounds of research that you do to inform this, because what you're really trying to get to is a prototype. When we talk about prototypes, we don't mean the beginning of a product, and we don't mean kind of the first version. We mean essentially a smoke and mirrors imitation of how the product will behave. Often prototypes just exist in design tools, they're not wired up to any real data, they may even just be on paper. But the idea is to have a representation of how your product will work that you can actually put in front of people and say, this is what we're planning to build. How, would you use this? And then how would you use this? It's really, really helpful to have good prototypes because it means that everybody in the business understands what you're proposing to offer. And it means you can go out and test that proposition again with your potential customers. And you can also test their experience, understand whether they would understand how to use this product if it was in front of them. So often you go around a few times on your prototypes until you settle on one that you're happy with. And then you can go and build it. Many companies miss this step. And the cost of missing this step is that you don't discover whether your product works until you've built it. And that's a very, very expensive time to find out that you need to change it. So the more prototyping you can do, the more confident you can be that you're going to build the right thing. Okay, so now we get to the development stage. This is where your engineers are actually going to take your requirements, going to take your design, and they're going to produce the real product. And your role as a product manager in that phase is really more of a project management role. Now you may be wondering what's the difference between project management and product management. Well, project management is the art of delivering a project on time and on budget. And project management is a skill, a core skill of product managers, but it's just one of many. Because the key distinction between a product manager and a project manager is that product managers have to do all that stuff we just talked about. It's a strategic role, it's planning, it's understanding the market, it's decision making. And the project management is just one piece during the flow where you make sure that the project gets executed well. Part of that responsibility is to defend your engineers from interruptions. So you're, again, the voice of the product inside the business. You keep the executive team informed. You work with all the other teams who have an interest in the product. Part of it is making what I call trivial decisions. So what you tend to find as you're developing a product is that there are the big decisions that have to be made early on as to what this is going to be. When you get into the details and when you start building it, there are always little things that aren't actually that important from individually, but which the engineers might not feel empowered to make that decision unilaterally. It could be simple things like, what language should we use for this label? What color should that button be? Where should this screen take you? What does this pop-up need to say? And someone has to make those decisions, and as the product manager, it's you. You're there, you're just a person anybody can turn to if they have a question or they're not sure what they should be doing. So hopefully, this will result in a high quality product that you're proud of. And when you've got that product, the next thing you need to do is launch it. And launching things is a whole challenge in and of itself, because there are lots and lots of factors that go into a successful launch. It's partly about the obvious things like, what's your go-to-market strategy? How are you going to market this product? What's your messaging around it? How are you going to tell a story that compels people to use it? Even if you think you've identified a clear need, how do you make sure that the people who hear about this product secondhand from their friends understand what it's offering them very, very quickly? But there's also a whole lot of other administrative work that needs to be done to prepare, to make sure that your product is for example, compliant with any regulations that it's subject to, that it's internationalized, so it works across countries, making sure that the documentation is in place, making sure that your sales team is prepared to sell it if you have one, making sure your support team is ready to support it. And again, as your product manager, your job is to make sure all of this stuff gets done. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to do it all yourself. You have to identify the right people who are going to make it happen and work with them to ensure it does. Some of those people will come to you because they'll be worried that you're not doing these things. And so you need to be there for them as well. So ultimately what you're aiming to achieve with a successful launch is adoption. You want to get people to use your product. And once you've done that, what happens? Once you've got your product out there, and what happens next? Well, it's by no means over, because that was just the first version. And that version itself needs to be maintained. So there'll be bugs you discover or problems. There'll be questions that come in from support or from your sales team. There'll be campaigns that the marketing team wants to run to promote it, and they want to run it by you. So there's a lot of work that goes on just to drive the success of the product once it's in the market. But at the same time, you're preparing for the next version. You're going around again, basically. And so the cycle begins again. And obviously, the second time round, you have the benefit of all the feedback you're getting from your new customers on the first version. So you're not operating in quite so much of a vacuum anymore. Okay. One thing I should stress, because it may not have been obvious so far, is that product managers manage products. They don't manage people. And what I mean by that is, you do not have organizational authority over any of those dependent teams that I just talked about. You don't manage designers, you don't manage engineers. Your job is to coordinate them, and therefore you need to build strong relationships with them. And you need to get to a position where they trust your judgment, and they understand that you understand the problem, and that you are working in the best interest of the product and the company. So it's a role of influence, not necessarily a role of authority. The good news about that is that managing people is quite a time-intensive process. You don't have to do any of it. You can just focus on your product. Okay, I'm just going to play a little video clip. Part of this project I've been doing is sitting down with existing successful product managers and just asking them a few questions about how they got involved and why they love the role. And I'll tell you at the end how you can go and watch those videos if you're interested in it. This is just a short excerpt from one that I thought was particularly interesting. This is a guy called Marty Kagan. He is highly respected in the global product management community. He was originally one of the product managers at Netscape, the original browser company back in the 90s. And then he spent a long time as a VP at eBay. And these days he runs what's called the Silicon Valley Product Group, which is a sort of a industry group in the Bay Area, and runs a lot of training and does a lot of consultancy to help companies build effective product teams. And so I asked him a number of questions about product management, and I just want to play you this quote, which I thought was quite interesting.
It's an amazing job, and I think there's a very strong argument to say it is the most important non-executive position in a company. It's really second only to the CEO, and that is, you can't say that about a lot of jobs, and a lot of people have found that this is not only a great job and a great career, but it's a proving ground for eventually starting their own company. In fact, a lot of the best investors out there will only invest in someone who has proven they can be a product manager successfully.
So what he's referring to there, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, is that there's a significant overlap between the skill sets required to be a product manager and the skill sets required to be an entrepreneur. In fact, you often find the product manager is described as the CEO of a product. So a lot of the skills you develop in the role are very helpful if you want to go on and found your own company in future. Okay, so I'm going to try something a bit new here. I've been doing this presentation for about 6 or 9 months now, and one of the pieces of feedback I've been given is that people want to hear about a real life example. It's easier to understand the role if we can talk through what was actually involved in launching a real product. And so this is a new section I added to the presentation, where I'm going to dive into the details of a particular product that I launched, talk about what that involved. And the case study I've chosen is something called styled maps. And this was taken from my time at Google when I was working on Google Maps. And I'll give you a bit more context before we begin. So when I was in Sydney, I was a product manager for the Google Maps API, which is actually a developer product. It's a little bit different from, say, an app on your phone or something like that. This is a set of developer tools that empower people who build websites to do creative things. And the specific service that this product provided was the ability to use Google Maps to visualize your own data on your website. And this is why you often see Google Maps crop up all over the internet on websites that are not actually Google websites. Those websites are using the Google Maps API. This is just one example. This is hotels.com. You can see that they're just using the product to map all their hotels and the availability of their hotels. So as a product manager, the audience for this product is actually developers and designers of websites. That was my audience. Those are the people who I served, because they were the people who decided whether to adopt this product or not. Okay, so before we talk about styled maps, I need to give you a little bit of an insight into the way Google Maps works, because it shares, the Maps API shares a lot of technology, unsurprisingly, with the regular Google Maps website. And one of the things it shares is the map itself. And the map itself is, at that time at least, was a set of images that were served up to you as you browsed around the map. And they were served up to you in these little chunks. So we don't send you the whole map, just send you it in pieces, and we fill the pieces in as you pan around to just give you the bits you need. And we call these pieces tiles. And when you zoom all the way out, you get to the point where the whole world fits on one tile. And that's as far out as you can go. It looks like that. If you zoom in one more, one level, then the size of the map doubles. The whole world fits on 4 tiles. Zoom in again, the whole world fits on 16 tiles, and so on and so on. At that time, there were about 17 zoom levels on Google Maps. And if you do the maths, that works out to something like 23 billion tiles. The reality is that there were some optimizations you can do to avoid spending a lot of time rendering tiles that just had empty oceans and deserts. You're still looking at probably around 4 billion or so tiles that actually had content on. Okay, so how do these tiles, how do they come into existence? This is not, Google's map is quite specific to Google, so clearly it's built by Google. And the way that works is Google has a huge database, custom database of all the geographical information that they've amassed. They've collected or licensed from all around the world that they have. It's a big monolithic thing. And at that time, every few weeks, they would run a job that would spit out an updated set of map tiles, because obviously you want the map to be reasonably fresh, reasonably recent. And that job would take a long time. It would take several hours to churn out these 4 billion or so tiles. And once it was done, all those map tiles would then be copied to every data center around the world that serves Google Maps, which again is a huge job. Think of how long it takes to download 4 billion images. It was a lot of work. And then when you or I use Google Maps, our browser requests the tiles it needs, and they just get served quickly out of that data center. The thing was, Google discovered that there were more and more scenarios cropping up where they needed to show a slightly different map to different people. So one example was disputed borders. This is an area in the north of India where India, China, and Pakistan meet. This is what Google Maps, the Google map of that area looks like if you're in India. If you're in China, it looks like that. India, China, India, China. So India and China disagree on where that border lies, and if you want to operate a mapping product in that country, one of those countries, you have to respect the borders as recognized by that government, or you're in a lot of trouble. Border disputes are a cause of no end of challenges. There was even a case a few years back where one country accidentally invaded another country because they did military exercises near the border, relying on Google Maps, and Google Maps had it slightly wrong. So these things are quite sensitive. Another example of where this need to show different maps to different people arises is localization. If you are Chinese and you're in China and you're looking at a map of Beijing, you expect all the labels and so forth to be in Mandarin. But if you're English, you need them to be in English in order to orientate yourself. And of course, that problem is fairly pervasive. Most countries have localized versions of their city names and even of the country names, Germany versus Deutschland and so on. So this was causing problems because now, rather than just having one set of tiles to generate and replicate, you have multiple sets, and multiple sets that have to be distributed. And it was becoming quite a problem. And so back in around 2009, the engineers in the mapping team at Google made the decision to try something pretty ambitious. At the time, it seemed like borderline madness. And that was that they believed that it was possible to change the architecture so that instead of rendering the map in one big job every few weeks, they would send to the data centers a lightweight, stripped down copy of that raw geographical data. And then they would have them draw the tiles in real time as you request them. Right? So every time anybody, every time anybody actually requests a map tile, the data center, software in the data center would get the geographical data, draw the tile, and send it back. So there would be no copy of it stored. It would all just be done in real time. And that would solve all these problems because you could just send exactly the right map for the right person. But it also opened up a world of new personalization opportunities, which was also very, very interesting. From my perspective, as the API product manager, my job was to think about, well, what does this technology allow us to do now that might be of interest to my audience? What are the new features that we could offer? And the key thing to realize is that if you're drawing the map in real time, you can do fairly radical things to that map. And you can allow the developers and the websites to decide exactly what they want that map to look like. You can let them decide exactly what features they want to show. You can let them decide exactly what color scheme they want to use. So this was the genesis of styled maps. So the first question is that useful? Is that something people actually want to do? But it turns out that we already had a significant amount of data that suggested that it was useful. And the first example was data visualization. So as I mentioned, Maps API heavily used for data visualization. And color is often a valuable tool to use when visualizing data. But if your map is already multicolored, it gets in the way. It's a bit confusing. What you really want to do is desaturate the map and strip out irrelevant features, as in this example, which is a heat map actually of investment activity on CrowdCube. So you can see here I've toned down the colors of the map and I've taken away all the roads and basically just made it much less intrusive. Another example that we saw fairly often was companies that wanted to style the map to match the house style of their site and of their brand. So if your website is predominantly black and orange, for example, you might want the map to look a bit more like that. In fact, there were articles around that time talking about Google Maps fatigue. It's just the idea that Google Maps was so prevalent across the internet that actually showing a Google map on your website wasn't particularly exciting or innovative anymore. This is just a fun example I found called Map of the Dead, which is a service that helps you find the resources you'll need in a zombie apocalypse. And so they've gone with a color scheme that more suits a zombie apocalypse. Okay, so we knew that there was an opportunity here, but we also had to understand what our constraints are. This is another important factor. And we were subject to some fairly strict constraints. And the main one is that the servers that generate these map images were required to respond in less than 10 milliseconds. So that process of drawing a map tile had to take less than 10 milliseconds. And the system was heavily, heavily optimized to ensure that that was always the case. And one of the things that meant is that we could not make changes or do anything that would increase the size of the data set that had to be sent to each data center that was used to render the map. So this had a couple of major consequences. One is it meant that we could not allow people to change the typeface of the map, because that would require us to add new font definitions to that data set. So we were stuck with the typeface as it was. And we also couldn't add new features. What I mean by that is we could not show on the map anything that wasn't already being shown on the map. And the reason for that is because in that optimization process I mentioned, that big data set was stripped right back to just what was needed to be drawn. So the example I've got here is the Devon flag. I live in Devon now. Counties. You might think that counties are shown on Google Maps, but they're not. If you go and look for them, you won't find county borders or county names on Google Maps. Google has the data, it's in that big database, but they've made a design decision not to show counties. Consequently, we could not enable that because it just wasn't there in the data that was in the data centers. In fact, this distinction, this need to limit ourselves only to what was already shown, used to crop up in a bunch of interesting ways. So for example, you might say, well, clearly you don't show counties, but you show countries. So presumably you could give me country outlines, right? Well, actually, no. We couldn't give you country outlines because the only country outlines that are shown on Google Maps are land borders. For the rest of the outline of the country, we should rely on the sea to provide that. So if I say to Google Maps, show me just the country borders, what I actually get is that, which is just the land borders. So unless you put the sea on top of this, you can't really understand what's going on. Iceland doesn't basically exist because it's an island. So these little things used to crop up fairly regularly. So it was important for us to understand our constraints and make sure we communicated that effectively to our developers. Okay, the next thing we had to do is figure out, well, what's the taxonomy? If we're going to allow people to decide how they want the map to look, we need to provide them with a way of referencing all the different types of data that are shown on the map. And that was an interesting conversation and you know, fairly contentious at times, because there are a million different ways to slice and dice the taxonomy on a map. This isn't actually the complete taxonomy, but it's kind of the highlights, the most popularly used categories. So that was what we call our selectors, our feature selectors. And then we had to decide what controls we were going to give you over how each of those types of feature were actually shown. And this was, again, an interesting challenge, because the obvious thing to do, the thing that we sort of assumed we'd do when we started, is just to let you choose the colour and whether it's shown or not. But it turns out that if you say, okay, I just want the rows to be this shade of red, and that's the way in which you model your design, firstly, it's very, very difficult to produce a good-looking map. There's a reason why cartography is both an art and a science. You will end up with something that just looks terrible. The other thing is there's a lot of detail and nuance in the way that these features are drawn. So, for example, roads obviously have an outline, they have labels on that tell you whether they're a one-way street or not. What are you going to do with all that detail? And what we realized actually was that we needed to make this sort of quick. We needed to make it possible for you to very quickly get the map looking a bit like what you want. So what I did was I asked myself, okay, well, who are the audience here and what tools are they used to using? What process do they go through when they're designing websites? And the answer is they use Photoshop or something like Photoshop. So you can imagine a designer getting a map, sticking it into Photoshop and kind of messing with it in Photoshop to make it look right. And Photoshop offers all these adjustment tools that allow you to change the color scheme, allow you to change the saturation, make it lighter or darker, that sort of thing. And we realized that these kind of adjustment tools perhaps were a better fit for our audience, and also a very quick shortcut, just getting the map to look the way you want. So you could just say, actually, I want a red map, or predominantly red map. And you could just say, set the hue of everything to red, but leave all the other color attributes, lightness and saturation, the same. And the map would just change, but it would still be very recognizable and usable. So we developed a set of what we call stylers, and they were modeled along this approach: hue, saturation, brightness, and a few others. So the last piece for us, and again this is a bit specific to a developed product, is we have to figure out what the programmatic interface was, which is essentially the developer equivalent of what your user interface is going to be. If you've done any programming, you'll recognize this as a JSON object, and it's a pretty kind of unpleasant one at that. Right? We didn't end up with something that we particularly loved. It was pretty heavily nested, like dictionaries inside lists, inside dictionaries, and so on. But sometimes you just have to accept the compromises that the technology forces on you. This was the best we could do. We just had to live with it. Okay, so while the engineers were off building that, now that we decided what we were going to offer and how it was going to work and what the API design would be, my job as a product manager was to get all those other functions happy before we launched. So here's some examples of some of the sorts of people I had to deal with. Not just for this launch, but for every launch that I ever did at Google. Because there are some things that Google in particular cares quite deeply about and is under a lot of scrutiny about. Privacy of user data, for example. Not something that affected this launch because we weren't dealing with user data, but something that certainly came up with other launches. Security, again, this was an evolution of an existing product, so not too bad there, but a big deal for new products. Capacity, are we going to overload the system? The legal side of things. So again, this often comes down to compliance and things like that, but in this case it was more about, is there a legal risk here if we allow websites to remove features from maps that actually are quite critical for safety? So, for example, if you had a map that looked exactly like a Google map, but someone had removed all the railway lines, is there a safety risk associated with that, with someone not realizing that there's a railway there? On the marketing side, we had to worry about not just how we market the product, but are we undermining our brand by allowing people to change the look of the map? The look of Google Maps is quite iconic, and that's actually quite valuable real estate, screen real estate that we have access to, across all these websites. And then pricing, which is always a tough challenge. And in this case, it was simply a question of, are we going to charge for this or not? In other words, are we going to limit the access to this feature to paying customers? And in the end, we decided that we would not do that because we realized that for us to drive any adoption of this feature, it would have to be, people would have to see it. People would not expect to be able to do this, and so they were only going to learn about the feature if they saw it in use. So we needed to maximize adoption just to create some momentum, otherwise it would probably never take off and not have been worth doing at all. All right, in the meantime, our tech writers were documenting this. Documentation is interesting because in some types of products, you don't want to have documentation at all, really. Often too much documentation suggests your product is too hard to use. For developed products, it's very important though. And sitting with a tech writer while they write documentation is always very insightful, because if a product is hard to document, it's almost certainly hard to use. It's almost certainly badly designed. So you can learn a lot from watching how a tech writer works. And as the product manager, my job was to review the documentation that's being written, provide feedback on the quality of it, and how easy it was to understand and follow, and ultimately sign off on it and say this is ready to be published. Also my responsibility to figure out the launch messaging. So I had to write blog posts that would announce this feature, and also the demos that would be shown to the press and at the launch event, which was Google's big developer conference. And in the process of doing that, I discovered, I had a sort of a realization about a week before it was due to launch. It wasn't a good realization. It was a realization that this product is too hard to use. That hairy-looking JSON structure I showed earlier was just too difficult to construct, and that nobody could realistically be expected to design a good-looking map, even with the simplified tools, if the way they had to do it was to craft that structure, chuck it into an application, see what it looked like, go back, edit that structure. Effectively, this product would not succeed in the market unless there was some tool available where they could just play with it, where they could just play with the design and experiment. And we had not factored that into the schedule, and we had not factored that in to the people we needed. And because it was 1 week before Google's big event of the year, there was nobody available to work on it. And I was very concerned, because I didn't want to launch a product that I knew would fail, but I also knew if we didn't have this tool, it was probably going to fail. So there was nothing to it. I had to hold myself up in a hotel next to the conference center where we were launching it for an entire weekend and write it myself. And as I mentioned, I'm not much of a programmer. I can get by, and I figured, I could probably hack something together that'll be okay. And then when we get back to Sydney, we'll get someone who knows what they're doing to write it properly. So I literally didn't leave my hotel room for an entire weekend other than to go get a pizza. And I sat on a bed that looked like this for 48 hours, and I just like crashed out bad JavaScript. And this came out at the end, which is not pretty, but it worked. It was sufficient to allow people to experiment, create styles just using a graphical UI, and play with it. Google replaced this with a better version 3 months ago. This was 2010, I wrote this. So I'll get someone to look at it later, never happened, and it continues to be used for 6 years. So there's a lesson in that as well. You never get back to the things you think you'll get back to. But having had this tool, we're now in a position to play with all the different permutations and combinations of the map and try different things, and just check it really worked well. And it mostly worked well. There was one problem I discovered, and I discovered this on the Sunday night before the Wednesday was going to launch, once I finished writing this tool. And that was that I went to test the use case I talked about earlier, the data visualization use case. I desaturated the map right down, and then I zoomed into San Francisco, and I saw this. Like, what is that? Like, why are all the road shields not being desaturated? So it turns out that they're a special case. It turns out that the map itself was drawn based on all this geographical data, and at the very end, when it was all done, the road shields, which were just images, were just placed on top. Nobody ever considered the possibility that someone might want to change the color. And this was not a simple problem. This was not like oh, okay, I'll just fix it myself thing. This is really foundational, because you're talking about having to say, okay, well, we've got this whole restyling system over here for all the vector data. Now we have to build another one for the image data. So there's nothing for it. I drop an email to the director of engineering in Seattle, who manages the teams that own all the map rendering infrastructure. And I say, look, we have a problem here. Like, we found what I consider to be a launch blocking bug, because data visualization is a primary use case. And he gets back to me and he says, sorry to hear that, but we're all a bit busy. Because it's the big event this week, right? There is as much of a resource crunch as we were. So I get on the phone to him and I say, I understand you're a bit busy, we're busy too, but can you just take a look at this tool I've written? Go through the following steps and tell me what you think. Tell me whether you think it's okay to launch this product in this current state that it is. And he played with it and he looked at it and he went, yeah, it's not good, is it? No. He said, okay, leave it with me, I'll see what I can do. So Monday comes around and I am wondering whether this is what's going to happen. And I get an email and it basically just says, I couldn't find anybody to work on this. So I stayed up late and fixed it myself. And so I managed to persuade an engineering director who hadn't written code in quite a while to just get stuck in, just to make it happen. And it's kind of interesting. I think the thing about that story that I like is the fact that the reason I was able to do that is because I had a good relationship with that person. That was the only reason. Under any other circumstances, it would have been like, who is this guy? Why is he calling me? Why is he giving me grief? We don't have anything, we can't, this is not something we can fix. He should have thought of this before. Tough, right? But I knew him and he knew me and he knew that I meant well and that I cared about my product and I was trying to do the right thing. And he helped me out. And it's just an example of why relationships are so important in this role. All right, so docs done, bugs fixed, tool in place, we could actually launch it. This is a video online which, you know, of the event actually where we launched it and the announcement. You know, and it all went very well and it felt good, right? It just feels really good to get something that you've been working on that long out the door. To take a vision that you have for something that you think might be useful and interesting and make it a reality. And then, in the long term, actually see it being used. This still makes me happy to this day. When I was building this section of this deck, I went onto the website of the San Francisco Intercontinental Hotel, the hotel I stayed in that weekend when I cranked out that tool. And I was just looking for a picture of the hotel to put in the slide deck. And what do I discover? They're using style maps. It's like made my day. This is amazing. It's all come full circle. And this, you know, and every so often it props up and I'm just like, huh, I made that happen. That was my thing. Plus, it facilitated this website, which is the most awesome website on earth, which is Yara Maps, which basically just turns Google Maps into Pirate Maps. It's amazing. The fact that the zoom control is a telescope is genius. So I thoroughly recommend that. Okay. So that's my story, that's a story, that's the story of one launch. In the time I was in that team, I managed about 40 launches, and many, many more since. And they all have these unique stories, they all have these unique combination of challenges and concerns and opportunities, the people you work with, and the way it pans out. Some of them went well, some of them didn't go so well. Some of those products have been killed off. In my time, I had to do my fair share of killing off other people's products that I'd inherited that weren't working very well, which isn't much fun. But it's always very diverse. Every launch is different. Okay, so I'm going to rattle through the last few sections there. As I mentioned, they're a bit shorter, just about and a bit more about why I think it's an interesting role and how you get started. So I'm just going to play this video clip, which is another of these from the videos I took. This is from a product manager at a company called Judil. They're based in London. They provide services to help companies understand the performance of other companies, basically. Sort of analysing their financial performance, their growth, and various other attributes. So I asked him what he enjoys about being a product manager.
So it's really seeing, I mean, if you want to kind of summarise it in one action or whatever, it's seeing the smile on people's faces when you've solved their problem. You know, there's nothing better than seeing that happen. I think there's a lot of work that goes into building something, but during that journey you learn so much about the problem you're solving, who you're solving it for, and you know, working with a team is one of the best things you can do. It is working towards a common goal, but not necessarily it being, you know, predefined. It's not in a sort of agency model. No, someone doesn't say, I want an e-commerce website built. It's, hey, here's a problem, how can we fix it? And in that regard, it's quite a creative role as well as one where you know, you have to hunker down as much as you can. Yeah.
So you've probably already got the impression that one of the nice things about this role is you get to work with an enormous variety of interesting people. And in the process, you learn a little bit about everything that they do. You're not going to become an expert marketeer by any means, but you'll learn a bit about marketing. You'll learn a bit about business development, a bit about sales, a bit about finance and legal and so forth. And you build a really broad, rounded skill set that's very transferable. There's also a huge variety of interesting companies that now hire product managers. This isn't just a list of companies I made up. I went onto a jobs website in the UK, I did a search for product manager, and I filled this slide with logos until I ran out of room, basically. So these were companies that were actively hiring product managers in the UK at the time I wrote this slide, which was about 2 months ago. It's also a role that just has a lot of opportunity, brings a lot of opportunity. So I mentioned before that a lot of product managers go on to found their own companies, or they might join a startup once they've scaled up, or they might go into a big technology company, someone like Google or Facebook, which is a very different experience, but fulfilling in its own way. It's also a very transferable role internationally. You can easily move abroad and work for other companies because there's demand for product managers essentially wherever there is a technology sector. In fact, product managers is the only role at Google where every 6 months they send an email to every product manager in the company that says, would you be interested in working in an office abroad? And if you say yes, they start sending you opportunities because they value the cross-pollination of ideas and they encourage product managers to work in different offices. And that was why it was so easy for me to move from London to Sydney to San Francisco. And what you find as a result of this is that product managers often go on to pretty interesting, often have pretty interesting careers. In fact, the current CEO of Google, Sundar Pichai, came up through product management. He was a product manager on Chrome, or director of product management for Chrome originally, and then he took on Android, and then he took on Google Apps, and just expanded until he took on the whole company, basically. Marissa Mayer, the current CEO of Yahoo, was originally a product manager at Google. Founder of Instagram used to be a product manager. Founder of Polyvore used to be a product manager. You tend to find that there's a lot of transition of product managers into these kind of leadership roles and executive positions. It's a well-compensated role. It's often sort of seen as part of the technical team, so you tend to find that the compensation tracks that of engineers. Engineers are quite expensive and in high demand. So if you love technology and you love working with people, but you don't necessarily want to be a coder, it's definitely a role to consider. So a quick summary. So responsibility and autonomy, a sense that you're working on something meaningful, chance to build an interesting skill set, work with a lot of interesting people, and then have lots of long-term options to go on to. All right, so that's sort of the pitch. But how do you get started? What would you do now? Right? So there's plenty that you can do now to get started if this is something interesting to you. There are communities all over the world, including several in London, that meet of product managers that meet regularly. Product Tank is probably the biggest one. That happens every month on the third Wednesday of every month. Not far from here. It's completely free. Anybody can turn up. You just have to register through meetup.com beforehand. And they have interesting speakers every month and then networking afterwards. There are other events that happen. Just kind of look for product management on meetup.com. There's plenty to read. And it's kind of lazy of me just to put the Amazon logo on there, because what I'm trying to say is there are books. But there's also lots of Medium articles, and the website I'll point you to the end has some references here for some good additional reading. There's also a strong product management community on Slack. And so there's just a few examples here of some Slack communities that are very active. You'll notice that this logo is the same as this logo, the Product Tank logo is mine. That's because it's the same organization behind both of those. They also run some big conferences, and they're kind of one of the big communities globally. And lastly, build something yourself. That's always the best advice. Try it, right? Even if you're not, because a basic understanding of how products get built and how and the challenges that engineers will face when building products is hugely valuable. So even if you're not deeply technical, just have a go. Even if it's just putting together a WordPress website, or just try building something for your phone. And don't just build it, actually see what it would take to get it on the App Store. Like, go through the process and experience it for yourself. And then if you really, really, really want to do this for real, you're going to need to find a job to apply for. And there are sort of two different approaches to that. One is to go for some of these, the larger companies have these dedicated graduate training schemes, very highly respected, quite competitive to get onto. I'm not going to lie to you, it's not easy to get a place on them. Google has one called the APM program, which has been essentially copied lock, stock and barrel by Yahoo, because it was started at Google by Marissa and then she moved to Yahoo. Facebook has one called the Rotational Product Management Program. And the thing that connects these is that you rotate through a number of different teams over the course of a couple of years and try your hand at different types of product management, and then you get to decide what sorts of products you want to work on. Or you can go the startup route. If you want to find jobs at startups, work in startups is probably the best place to start. It's a pretty lively jobs board. It looks like it was built in the late 90s, but it does work. AngelList is becoming increasingly the place where companies go for high quality tech talent, sort of replacing LinkedIn, which become quite noisy. The signal-to-noise ratio on LinkedIn is pretty bad. So if you do apply for a job you see on LinkedIn, you have to work really hard to make sure that you stand out, because you tend to get, I can say as a recruiter, you'll get a lot of applications, and many of them will be quite weak. And then Mind the Product, that same organisation, have just started their own jobs board as well. I used to talk a bit about the interview process, but I figured that was a bit premature, and that the case study might be better use of time. But if you do get to an interview, there's plenty of good information out there on how to excel in a product management interview, and this book is a brilliant place to start. It's very, very comprehensive. It talks about how the interviews tend to be structured across different companies, the sorts of questions they'll ask and what they're looking for. I'm not on commission, by the way. And you can also practice. There's this great website called the PM Interview, which will just fire questions at you relentlessly until you curl up and die. And has a timer, and you just get a sense of practicing. Okay, last but not least, I've put together a website that goes with this presentation. It has a bunch of supporting material that you can use for further reading. It's also where I post the videos and those little video stories that I showed you some of, and go into a little bit more depth about some of the aspects of product management. So feel free to check that out as well. And that's all right.